Could you tell us what's the state of ISIS in Southeast Asia?
ISIS presents unprecedented global threat. ISIS is a hyper powered organization. We have not seen a group of the scale and magnitude of ISIS. Certainly, ISIS has a very significant and a growing presence in Southeast Asia. There are 22 groups that have pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or expressed support to ISIS, currently operating in Southeast Asia. Many of the groups in Malaysia has been dismantled, but the groups in the Philippines and in Indonesia are active. And it is these groups that are disseminating the propaganda and facilitating the travel of Southeast Asian Muslims to the core area of Iraq and Syria.
And how are authorities dealing with this?
Governments have uneven response. Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia have responded decisively. The Indonesian legislation is problematic. In the case of the Philippines, government needs added capability to be more decisive to dismantle their domestic groups, including those groups with links to ISIS.
We don't have any evidence Filipinos have traveled to Syria. Is that correct? Why?
At this point, there is no information, both in the open source and in the classified literature, that Filipinos have traveled to Syria and Iraq. Certainly, Filipinos have tried to travel, and some have been arrested. But at this point, there is no verifiable information or intelligence that Filipinos are participating in the conflict in Syria and Iraq. This may change because there's a lot of propaganda and there are financiers, ideologues who are emerging in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, linked to ISIS.
Should authorities pay attention to it?
Yes, governments must contain, isolate and eliminate the ISIS influence in Southeast Asia to prevent ISIS declaring a vilayat or a province either in the Philippines or in Indonesia.
You say the Philippines or Indonesia. I mean, is the Philippines vulnerable?
Yes, the Philippines remain vulnerable because there are three groups that are close to ISIS ideologically, although we have not yet seen operational links between those groups. But it's a question of time if these groups are allowed to persist, and if these links are not broken, such relationships will be established. The same way MILF built a relationship with Al-Qaeda, and subsequently Abu Sayyaf group built a relationship with Al-Qaeda.
What happens if the Bangsamoro law fails to pass?
I believe that Philippines government must go out of their way to resolve this conflict, to give whatever they can within certain limits, to ensure that the majority community is also with the process to devolve power. But it is essential, it is crucial for the growth and stability of the Philippines to accommodate the Moros that have joined the peace process.
And in Indonesia, how would you describe the threat today?
Threat is very severe in Indonesia. ISIS is sprinting, government is crawling. There must be extraordinary leadership and will on the part of government to fight ISIS. ISIS is spreading like a cancer in the region, including in Indonesia. Indonesia remains the heart of ISIS-linked groups at this point.
The impression I get from what the Malaysians have done is that it has spread faster in Malaysia, but that they've been able to break up the groups. Is that, how would you describe the threat in Malaysia?
The Malaysian Special Branch is a highly capable group. Although the ISA was repealed, which was a huge mistake, the Malaysian police have been able to detect and disrupt ISIS operations, including operations to kidnap their political leaders, conduct terrorist attacks. But certainly the Malaysian Special Branch needs all the assistance to fight this threat. The Malaysian model for fighting terrorism is a very impressive one. But again, it was a monumental mistake on the part of the political leadership of Malaysia to repeal the ISA without preventive detention. It's very difficult for any government in the world to fight terrorism today.
In terms of how it's evolved from the threat that was Al-Qaeda to this today, how did this What's the connection? Are there any connections? How do you see this threat having moved?
Al-Qaeda is a kindergarten group compared to ISIS. ISIS is a very powerful terrorist group. Al-Qaeda at its peak had about 2,500 members, but only about 400 to 600 active combatants. In the case of ISIS, they have over 30,000 fighters. ISIS is a superpower terrorist group, and to dismantle ISIS, the international community needs to work together. Current military, diplomatic, political, economic, and informational measures by governments have not been successful to curb and curtail ISIS. ISIS should be contained and isolated and eliminated, because ISIS presents a very long-term strategic threat to governments worldwide, especially in the Middle East, and also Muslim governments, Muslim countries, Muslim populations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East.
Is this an evolution of Al-Qaeda or a completely different group?
ISIS originated from Al-Qaeda. Abu Musab al-Zakawi from Zakka in Jordan traveled with his mentor Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi to Afghanistan in the late 1990s. He received funding from bin Laden and he created his own training camp, the Al-Mata training camp in Herat. And his own group evolved from Tawhid wal Jihad to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq. And of course, after Zakawi's death, it evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and now into the Islamic Caliphate or Islamic State. There's no fundamental difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but ISIS is more permissive. But their ideology and genesis is the same.
And in terms of Southeast Asia and Jemaah Islamiyah, how do you see them connecting?
Jemaah Islamiyah has split because traditionally JI swore its allegiance and had most links to Al-Qaeda. So one part of JI is with ISIS, other part is opposing ISIS. But certainly, if either Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or Ayman al-Zawahiri are killed, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS will merge. That means the two world's most dangerous terrorist groups will come together. That means these two groups will then pose a very severe threat to international security.
Last question is, how would you gauge the U.S. response to ISIS so far?
U.S. has appointed a very able Commander General John Allen to lead the coalition, but without boots on the ground, it is impossible to dismantle and disintegrate ISIS. It is paramount for there to be greater will on the part of the Western nations that have the world's finest armies to work together with their Middle Eastern counterparts and also other countries to dismantle ISIS. ISIS is not only a Middle Eastern group, it's a global threat. The world must come together to fight ISIS.